Okay, so welcome again for everyone who's joining us. This is our first Producers Talk Story session. What's we hope to have many more in the future. And this one's going to be focused on crafting a strong funding application. So just to go over some basic housekeeping notes first. The talk story session will last about 1 hour, followed by 30 minutes for Q&A. And if you have a question, you can use the Q&A feature that should, I believe it's at the bottom of the screen there on Zoom, to submit your question. And Cheryl, who you hear but can't see also on this webinar, she's PIC's Managing Director and VP of Programs. And she's here with us and will be keeping an eye on the questions that come in. So if it's pertinent to the topic being discussed, we might address it in the moment. Otherwise, we'll save it for the Q&A portion at the end of the webinar. And as we mentioned briefly before, it might have been before some of you came on the line, but this webinar is being recorded and we'll make it available on our website. So we'll email everyone who has registered and post the link on our social media as well once it's available. So you can revisit it, you can share it with people. And for those of you who are new to PIC, we'll just start really quickly with who we are. PIC being Pacific Islanders in Communications. And our mission is to support, advance, and develop Pacific Island media content and talent that results in a deeper understanding of Pacific Island history, culture, and contemporary challenges. One of the main ways we do that is to fund films for public media, broadcast, and in the case of the Digital Shorts Fund, streaming platforms. So we have different funding initiatives throughout the year, but today our focus is really going to be on applications for the Digital Shorts Fund because that application window has just opened up as of March 3rd. And the deadline is going to be April 3rd. So we're just in the beginning of that application period right now. And that application is pretty similar to our media fund. So much of this information will also apply to that. And with us today, we have 3 PIC-funded filmmakers. At the far end here, we have Conception Alessino. She's the producer on The Queen's Flowers, which is a DSF-funded project. She also has a vast production experience with both documentary and narrative. In the center, we have Kiara Lacey, who is director on the Queen's Flowers with Connie, and also Out of State, which is another feature-length project supported by the Media Fund. She has extensive documentary experience, both in producing and directing, as well as narrative films. And here we have Braden Yoder, who was an applicant to our inaugural Digital Shorts Fund call. And that project that he applied with is now finished. It's called Last Taxi Dance, which he directed. And I believe the 3 of you worked on together, is that right? Yes. Yeah. And it screened in numerous festivals and garnered a bunch of awards. So thank you all for being here and joining us to talk about this. We'll talk through each piece of the application. And I want to note that, oh, sorry, Cheryl just mentioned that I didn't introduce myself. Kaylee Dillon. And I'm the program manager here at PIC. Thank you, Cheryl. So we're going to talk through each piece of the application. And I wanted to mention that all of these, this information, these application pieces, are described in detail on our website as well. So you can reference that. It's on our Digital Shorts Fund page under the subcategory How to Apply. Cheryl, are you able to show us a screen share of that? Here we go. Great. So you can see it there. That is how you can also access the application portal that's live right now. But you'll also see that it goes through each of the application pieces and gives quite a detailed description of all of the pieces. All right. Thank you. So we'll go through all of those. I'll talk a little bit about what we're looking for from the funder's perspective, and then open it up to the three of you to tap into your knowledge and experience with each of them. So first off, the type of projects that the Digital Fund is for. Shorts, which is a little bit self-explanatory, but that means so 15 minutes or less. They can either be fiction or nonfiction, and there are a couple differences in the application, whether it's a fiction or nonfiction project. We'll talk about that a little bit later, what those differences are. We're looking for untold stories or fresh perspectives on the Indigenous Pacific Islander experience. Subject matter that covers issues important to Indigenous Pacific Islanders and that will encourage deep and meaningful thinking and conversations. And at PIC, we define Pacific Islanders as descendants of the Indigenous peoples of Hawaii, Guam, American Samoa, the Northern Marianas, and other Pacific Islanders of Micronesia, Melanesia, and Polynesia. And these digital shorts are primarily for online streaming, but we do ask for the option to broadcast them as well if the opportunity arises. And then our last piece here before we jump in is how the applications are reviewed. So we compile an independent review panel, and that's made up of filmmakers, cultural advisors, public TV executives, and others who are working in related fields. And they'll read through every application and provide comments and recommend them for funding or not. And this is important because even if you've spoken with one of us at PIC about your project before, that person is ultimately not the one reviewing your application. So you really want to make sure that you're being thorough with all of your application materials, because this information is all that the panelists have to go on. So you want to make sure that any reader would know what you're talking about and have an understanding of your vision. So a good tip to that end is when you finish your application, ask someone who knows nothing about your project to read over it and give you some feedback, make sure it all makes sense. So without any further ado, I think we're going to jump in to the application components. And our application is modeled after the IDA Documentary Core app. So if you're applying to a bunch of different funding opportunities, you'll notice that a lot of the pieces that are being asked for will overlap, and many of them are similar, but you should be sure to really look at what's being asked of you from each place, just to make sure that you're hitting all of the points that we at PIC are asking for, and if there are any specific forms that you need to be filling out, etc. Okay. So first up, we have the project description. This has a number of subcomponents to it. We have the synopsis, the treatment, the filmmaker's statement, the topic summary, and the artistic approach. And you can reference all of that information on our website for the particulars of each. But the main point of this section is really for you to show us that you have a story. And the treatment is a really important piece of this, and it's one that a lot of people get hung up on. So in the treatment, we really want you to let us see into your vision. How will the story play out? And tell us this in as specific a way as you can. So we want to see plot points and narrative trajectory. We want you to tell us the story from the beginning through to the middle and the end with as much detail as possible, which includes visual language, storytelling tools, so we can really see your film in our minds. And especially with documentaries, we know that things can and will change as you're filming and as the story is actually unfolding. But give us the best guess that you have at this moment. And another important part to mention is characters. So we want to see strong characters who will guide us through your story. And in narrative, you're often creating those characters. We want them to be compelling. And in documentary, those are often real people. So we want to see that you have access to who you're telling the story about. So with that in mind, Kiara, could you talk a little bit from a documentary perspective about how you approach this, both character-wise and kind of like nailing down the story trajectory in documentary?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest questions is if you're doing a verite documentary or if there's any sort of like discovery in the process of making your documentary, how do you address the end? And I think, you know, as you stated, give your best estimates, you know, what your expectations might be. Don't feel like you need to like provide the solid end either. I think as long as you're honest and clear about what stage you're at and what your expectations might be, and are very clear about what the stakes are for your characters. So bringing it back to your characters, like what your characters want, and what the struggles or obstacles against that your characters are struggling with. As long as you can kind of convey that, and I think you'll be okay. Yeah.
And Braden, could you talk a little bit about it from a narrative perspective? You know, how you approach this piece.
So for our short film, we focused on just one single relationship that could hopefully propel the whole story forward. In one location too, which made it obviously easy to a lot easier to shoot. I think with the short film, you don't have a lot of real estate to play with, so you can't be jumping around in so many different locations, and then also it helps on budget to stay in one place. As far as the characters, I mean, you have a protagonist and then you have an antagonist, and the antagonist is the person whom without there is no story, and just focusing on that particular relationship is what we did with our short film.
Yeah, that's a good point. That in because we're dealing with a limited amount of time, 15 minutes isn't actually that long to tell a story.
Right. Well, like when Kiara and I were putting together that application for Taxi Nats, I went back and looked at a lot of the Oscar-winning short films just to sort of see what kind of the benchmark was to reach for. And generally, they all generally had one single relationship that the audience can invest in and follow along to its completion, beginning, middle, and end. And so I just thought that that's a great model to go off of. So.
Yeah, that's a good point. Any other thoughts to chime in there? That covers it. Okay. So moving on to the script. The script will just apply to narrative films. So this is the script, and then the next piece, the lookbook, are two portions of the application that only apply to narrative applications. So if you're doing documentary, you don't have to worry about these two pieces, but we're going to go through them. So really with the script, we want to see if it makes sense. So if all the story points are included, and if they carry through your story. Does it tell the story adequately, and does it match the world that you've created in your treatment in the big first piece? Can you talk a little bit about like how you approached your script with Last Taxi Nats?
Sure, and I think this is actually a great place that these other Connie and Kiara can weigh in, because as producers they're looking for things. But for me, it was just great to have people to turn to and to be able to get that feedback to, just friends who could read the script. And then with producers who know what to look for, particularly who have a lot of experience, seeing if this script is something that could be fundable, if it's well written. There's nothing worse than reading something that's a chore to get through. And you have to think about your audience when it comes to that. And you want to write a tight script, but you also want to write something for funding, and you don't want to you don't want to over direct on the page. You don't want to make it a chore to read through, because people will put it away after the first couple pages. I mean, isn't that about right? Or
I think absolutely. Concentrating on your audience and, like Braden said, your funders is a great way to stay on task, along with the story that you have in your head. I think that a compelling script, one that really, even if it's not final, but it gets us through the 3 stages of, emotional attachment with the characters, I think would be a good way of guiding the script and making sure that's on point.
Yeah.
So Kaylee, sorry, real quick, so everyone, this is Cheryl. I noticed that someone posted a question. This person asked, does your script need to be the final version, which is a good segue into what Connie was talking about. So your script doesn't need to be the final version. We wouldn't expect you to submit your application, then be awarded funding, and then, go straight into shooting. If you feel like you still need to kind of work on your script a little bit. And it all depends on what phase you're applying. What phase your project is at when you're applying for funding. Just be really, really transparent when you talk about where you're at with your project. And that way that really sets up the expectation of whoever the readers are. If you say that you've been working on the script, but you feel like there's still some revisions that need to happen, and you're thinking about different approaches to it, I think being strategic in how you word it, so it doesn't sound like you're just turning in a first draft, but that you've reached a certain point, a really good point, but you just need to tweak, I think is fine.
Great. Thank you. Okay. So now moving on to the lookbook. The lookbook, again, is just for narrative projects. And this piece will really help us visualize what your film is going to look like, what it's going to feel like, and the visual tools that you're going to use to tell your story. So just a couple examples of that would be like the location, the costume, the time, the lighting, some things like that. And I thought it would be good to use a couple examples from your works to illustrate this a little bit. So we've got, Cheryl, could you screen share us on, yes, the last taxi dance. And if you want, you're welcome to kind of scroll us through it. Do you want to do that?
Sure. So that first slide is actual archival AP photo of a taxi dance hall back in 1941. And that little receipt there is the photographer's description of what's happening in the hall there. And so, leading off of that, the idea was to kind of throw everybody into this historical world that we wanted to recreate. Everyone gets an idea straight off the bat from that one. Then add a little bit of text, just obviously explaining it, and chose that particular record there just because our initial song in the film was meant to be a Hop Holly kind of swinging sort of songs. I thought that was just a nice little cue into that. After exploring the world and the location, historically, Chapin and I went to look into Chinatown itself, and we took some photos of places where we wanted to stage the actual film and try to get close to the introduction, the introductory photos. So the next slide is where we actually ended up shooting, which is the old Indigo's Anu Hotel. But we also had a couple other backup options. We had a Chinese restaurant ballroom. It's the next slide. And then the slide after that is just sort of the world of Chinatown, the location and the historical feel, the milieu, just to again establish the fact that this is meant to be a historical fiction piece. After that, I believe we go into the movement, and the point here, and you can't put everything in a lookbook, but we try to just lead with the things that we did know about. The point here was to show the difference between the first half of the film and what was intended as the second half. So the first half was meant to be, or the first third was meant to be very boisterous. Maxwell Fools was one of our references, this kind of old style camera movement, which is very fluid. And then to contrast that with the much slower, much more deliberate pace of the second part of the film, so that there would be a contrast for the viewers, and we get them into two different spaces as we go through the whole film. This might be a little too pretentious to reference Tarkovsky, but the idea was to really throw out something that was different and diametrically opposed to the first part of it. After that, we went into the lighting a little bit. We talked about this hard lighting, old style to kind of evoke the 40s, which is pretty much what we did in the opening scene. There was a sort of Greta Garbo treatment for our lead, Danielle Zalapany, which then contrasted with the second half again, where the lighting was meant to be softer, when the lights come on in the taxi dance hall after everybody's left. And then finally after that, we went into the costuming, and we had a great costume researcher at that point. We'd done a lot of work for us, and he created a Pinterest board. And knowing that we wanted to try to create something in a historical fiction world, obviously the costuming is super important. And that's it. We didn't talk about the other things because we didn't know them at that point. We had the cinematographer, me, a producer, a costume researcher, and a choreographer committed when I sent the application in. And so that's the stuff we put into the lookbook.
Great. And you can really tell, so I never saw the lookbook until after I'd actually seen the film, but going kind of backwards, I guess you could say, it really matches up. Like you can tell how much the feeling of what you were trying to put out there carried through to what actually happened in the film. And I believe we also have, yes, the lookbook for the Queen's Flowers, which Connie and Kiara, could you take us through?
Yeah, for us, we did a lot of archival, same, it's a historic piece. So we went to, the library and grabbed the images that sort of match this world that we are trying to create, at least on the first set of slides. And referencing costuming again, just sort of like, we pick Queen Kumani, who's it's a big character. So we sort of want to tell with our lookbook how, through which lens we're looking at her.
And I'd say, whatever details that are specific to your film, feel free to include. The lookbook isn't like a hard and fast rule where it has to be this, or this. If your film is a Hawaiian sci-fi, then maybe you want to talk about different things, or include different imagery, or costuming is important. So, everyone can kind of feel like you can add in the details and focus on the details that are specific and appropriate towards your project. Ours has kids, so we got to have some smiling kids in there. So let's see what else we got in there. Yeah, and just things that give a mood or a tone or a sensibility for the piece. Like, this is The Queen's Flowers is a children's short film with a sense of magical realism. So to infuse these kind of images with, like, beautiful lighting, and Fun stuff.
Dream world.
Yeah, let's all dream, guys.
Only seeing a black screen. No.
Someone is only seeing black screen, Cheryl. We just got a chat in.
Oh no.
Oh, did we lose Cheryl?
Cheryl, are you there?
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. Could you see it on your end?
We could see the lookbook on our end, yeah.
Okay. Apologies for the black screen. Hopefully the recording will have captured it. We'll go through and the recording after this webinar and make sure.
Great, thanks.
A few more questions.
Okay, so should we jump back into the lookbook?
Oh, I thought we covered it.
Oh, we did.
Okay.
Or did
Yeah,
we
I
finish
think that
it?
gives,
Okay, sorry, I thought
I
there was
think that
more.
gives people a sense.
Oh yeah, there were a couple of people that had trouble seeing that. We'll make sure that the that it carried through to the recording version and look into that. So sorry about that. Okay, so next up we have the work in progress. This piece is not required for the Digital Shorts Fund, but if you have one for your project, make sure that it's the best representation of what you're trying to put out there. So in other words, don't throw it together at the last minute just to have something for that category. It should really represent the concept of your project, and you want to make sure that it's in alignment with what you presented in the rest of your application. I don't know if anyone has any other thoughts on that.
I've definitely personally submitted work in progress samples that had content that we'd shot to date, and this is coming from a documentary's perspective, obviously, but it wasn't representative of the full concept of the piece, and so it didn't match the treatment, and that actually was a disservice to our application as a whole. So yeah, and it's confusing for readers. Like, why does the treatment say this, but the work in progress doesn't reflect that? And there are ways you can address that. Like maybe you put in a note saying, you know, this is just representative content we have to date and we're missing this. Or, you know, wait, hold on to your content and not share it for the work in progress. Because again, if it isn't wholly representative of what you're trying to pitch, and if it doesn't match the rest of your application, it will do, or it has the potential to do a disservice to your submission. So worth considering.
Yeah, and it's a good point too that consistency throughout all of these pieces is definitely something we look for. And part of why having a strong treatment is so important, because so many of these pieces refer back to that, where when someone's reviewing the application, they're going to be looking back at how well you're able to put into place these different pieces that you've laid out as your vision. Yeah, so that's a really good note. Okay, so moving on to the timeline. Timeline, a big thing that we want to see here is it realistic? And how likely is the project to be completed if we award it funding? So details are really helpful, as specific as you're able to be. And in general, with the Digital Shorts Fund, we would like projects to finish within 18 months of signing the contract. However, this isn't a hard and fast rule. It's more of a guideline. We want you to make the best film possible, and we don't want you to have to rush through the process just to meet that number. So if your timeline is longer than 18 months, that's definitely a conversation that we can have. That's generally the guideline of what we're looking for with these shorts. Which again is to say, you know, don't rush it, but also, especially when it comes to documentary projects, don't just have an open-ended timeline that never has a finishing point. while you're waiting for a desired outcome to happen. Like, we need to see that there is a point at which you anticipate finishing this story. Connie, could you talk a little bit about how you approach putting that together? Because I think sometimes that can be a hard thing to start to
Yeah,
dive into.
it's, I think Brayden actually had a really great suggestion, which was, you know, try and do it in the amount of time that is going to take you to do a certain thing. Goal-based is, I believe, a great suggestion to do that. And knowing your process, and I think this ties into the working processes, when you come to this application or different applications, you'll be in different stages of your own. So what you can know, the knowns and the unknowns, you have to factor those in when you are creating your plan. So as much knowns as you have, the more realistic your timeline will be. So I think that being able to do that in a goal base, and then whether you want to put actual dates to that, considering where you are and where you need to be, that's another good second step.
Do you all have anything else to add on that, as far as like how you, the kind of pillars you've used to construct your timeline?
I just leaned on my producers who have so much more experience. But what I thought I could talk about real quick is just what our actual timeline was for Taxi Down. So we found out in June that we received the grant. In September, we finalized the contract with PIC. We shot in February. So that left us the fall to raise more money, and then in January to do all the pre-production. We shot towards the end of February. And then post was pretty much from March through the end of July. So it was ready to go by August, which is roughly 14 months from when we got the initial funding letter that said we were funded. I think that's probably a decent ballpark roughly for this kind of thing. I don't think it needs 18 months. It's nice to have that, but somewhere between 12 to 15, I would think you should be able to finish it. Plus, you wouldn't want to go 18 months. You really want to keep churning out content and get it done as quickly as possible. But that was how it went for us.
I think the only add-on I would have to the timeline is if there are certain hard and fast dates, like start building from there. So actor availability or crew availability, let's say, or location availability. If those are things that are essential to your project and those are priorities, then lock those dates down and then do your best to build everything in a realistic sense around that. That was yours. That's what you said.
I learned from you.
That was what Brayden said yesterday.
Learned it all from Kiara and Connie.
Okay, so now budget. Budget is always one that I feel like feels like kind of a mammoth project to approach. So we're going to dive into it. For the PIC application, we have a template that we require you to use, and that is downloadable on our website. A key feature of that is details, lots of details in your line items. It's something that you should really have thought through quite a bit. And from our perspective, we want to see how realistic is it for what you're proposing. And what's behind that is we want to make sure that you don't run out of money and end up unable to finish your film. That said, we know that some projects will need more than the $25,000 that we offer for the Digital Shorts Fund. So make sure that you're planning to fundraise all the money that you will actually need, even if that's more than what we can provide. And a couple specific notes on our budget. We allow in-kind, but it needs to be capped at 15% of the total budget. And additionally, as far as equipment purchases go, you can use PIC funds to purchase equipment, but that is capped at $500 total, which often is really enough to cover, hard drives and that sort of equipment. but equipment rentals and the like they're not included in that. That's totally acceptable. So if you do have a number of big equipment purchases planned or that you anticipate, then you're going to want to seek other modes of funding for that. So Connie, I've heard that you are a whiz with budgets. Where do you start when you're diving into this part?
I think for me, for budgets, you know, when going into a film, it always has to be a twofold relationship between budget and script, and they have to complement each other and work together in order to create the desired product. So in order to do that, you have to be thorough with your script, break it down to its, you know, however much you can break it down, and look through your categories of your budget and make sure that the categories are filled. It's always easier to draw a budget down than to be hopeful with the budget. Be very realistic. I think Kiara was mentioning, you know, if you don't know how much something costs, make sure you pick up the phone and get quotes. That's a brilliant suggestion, especially for people starting, because often you don't know, you know, what these things cost. I think having PIC as an ally to be able to ask questions as, you know, like what are the things that most people leave out of budgets? Those are valid questions, and I'm sure, you know, a lot of people would be able to help you with that. But making sure your categories are covered, making sure you understand all the categories, that you think of all of the things that are going to be needed to be able to do this. And at a certain point, know that, you know, at certain places, your story will be bigger than your budget, and then your story needs to complement the budget that you actually do have, or the other way around. So I think for me, that's the key to success, to be able to be, you know, a budget is, it's what guides you, it's what keeps you moving forward, and what is going to drive this. So you really have to think just as hard about the story and the viability of your project by looking at your budget.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good way to think about it.
Sorry, I have one thing that I think that folks should think about, which is that your budget, to some extent, should align with your timeline. So if you're talking about, you know, so many weeks or so many months in post, just make sure that, you know, that's reflected in your budget, and whether it's in kind or, you know, or an expense line item, just make sure that, you know, they pretty much match up. There have been times where, you know, budgets and timelines haven't matched up, and so that just leaves the reviewers kind of questioning, like, oh, you know, similar to the WIP and treatment discussion, like this, they're saying they're going to be doing this in their timeline, but the numbers in their budget don't reflect that. So just keep an eye on that.
Yeah, and that's a good note as well, especially if you have, you know, multiple people from your project working on different pieces of this application, to make sure that before it's all submitted, you're getting together and integrating the parts to make sure that different pieces do match up and reflect, again, consistency throughout these pieces, like the timeline and the budget. Kiara, did you have anything budget-wise?
One note for me in terms of budget, think about what your priorities are. What are the things that are really essential to making your film, and how much those will cost you, so you can make sure you're preserving the creative integrity of the piece and kind of build out from there. And I think Connie had sort of touched upon this, but just as a reminder, when you do get into contracting, because hopefully everyone gets awarded their funds, make sure you're mindful of what all the deliverables are. So if you're not familiar with what that means, just all the things that you have to provide PIC when you complete your film. So make sure you're clear on that, and that you've set aside all the right amounts of money so that you can satisfy your obligations.
And to keep in mind that, your budget will reflect itself in the end as, your reporting, because, we are under contract, so we are reporting what we're doing. So you have to remember to be in line at all times and keep up with the categories, and you set out the correct amount in the correct categories, because moving forward, shifting those might be a little bit more challenging for you at the reporting end. So being mindful of that process, having perhaps a person that is overseeing that and that is taking, the lead on that. It's important. A lot of times the producer director role gets, a little bit too hectic, and don't do yourself a disservice. Make sure that you at least have somebody helping and keep an eye on that, making sure that the budget, it's being treated with as much care as the script. I can't emphasize that enough.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you were talking about this the other day. It also requires, if you get past funding and you're working on your project, it requires very regular check-ins and maintenance to make sure that.
Also to get the rest of the funds, right?
Yeah,
Because
absolutely.
PIC releases the funds in stages, and you have to, we're accountable to PIC to be able to make sure that we are meeting our targets and those deliverables that Kiara talked about. So
Yeah, so it really behooves you to have a well thought out, organized budget from the start, because you're going to have to pay for it later if you don't. Okay, that's great. So then moving on to fundraising strategy and grant impact. If you need more funds for this project, how do you plan to raise the rest of them? And specifically here, like, where are you looking? Do the funders you're planning to apply to make sense? How do they align with your film and the goals for your film? In addition to, how is this grant going to be helping you? Do you all have just any quick additions to the fundraising strategy section? Or like a good resource starting point to if you're short funds and you're looking for options as far as like how to begin to answer that question of who should I be reaching out to?
Call your grandma. I think if you are considering crowdsourcing or any sort of similar opportunity, think truly about how much you might be able to raise in your network. Like, who would give you money? Maybe these are things that best practices have been issued by like Indiegogo or Kickstarter, or a lot of these organizations that are platforms to help you crowdfund. So if you are, I definitely recommend looking at what their best practices are, and they do post, and like if you dig a little bit, they provide a lot of that information. But sit down and actually think realistically about how much you might be able to do, so that you aren't just saying, you know what, I want $20,000 and we're gonna, that sounds like a great idea. I would like $20,000 too, but I don't know, I don't think my friends and family have that. So, really good to sit down, talk to your team, and see what might be realistic in terms of how much you think you could get in. Mm-hmm. And, you gotta sometimes you have to get creative. Who knows how you could, maybe you go back to old school fundraising and sell chili or wash cars, or or do a benefit dinner. There's all sorts of like creative things that you could do to fundraise. And we hadn't talked, I won't get fiscal sponsorship. We didn't talk about any of that. Mm-hmm. Okay.
No.
I would add just this is one thing that was good for, even though I hated writing it at the time, was the audience engagement strategy. I mean, that's a bullet later on that we will get to, but being able to find that audience and then being able to think locally, who would engage with this, because those are the people who are going to give you, if anyone's going to give you money, not just family and friends, but different institutions. Once you kind of define your target audience, you can go out and seek and find people who will give, which is what happened for us. So
yeah, that's a great point. Okay, so we've got moving on to work sample. The sample that you choose for this, does it show us that you'll be able to do what you're proposing? Ideally, it would be a work that's in the same genre or a similar genre as the proposed project. And ideally, it would be your work that you're showing us. It is possible you can submit something from your DP or your editor if you don't personally have one that you feel like is applicable. But just remember that the sample is supposed to be an example of your ability to tell a compelling story. So that was pretty straightforward.
I would say if there are any gaps in between the project that you're proposing and the work sample you're providing, use that space that's given to sort of write up, okay, these are the things that I see in this work that are relevant, and recognize that not all of it is. As long as you're explaining where you're coming from, I think that always helps to get the readers who are reviewing your grant oriented in the right direction, so they know that you're not crazy. You're trying to make a drama and you're providing a comedic work sample. Like, you could at least like explain why you think there's a relevance in there, or what pieces are still relevant.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, our key creative personnel. So we want to make sure that you have people on the project who know what they're doing. And this will hopefully come through in the bios of the people that are going to be involved. And if you do have key creatives who have signed on to your project at the time that you're applying, we need to have letters of commitment from them as well, so that it's proof that like they really have signed on, and we can count on that, and you can count on that. And having Pacific Islanders as part of your key creative team is not technically required, but it is something that that we look at positively. It's a very good thing to have involved, especially as we're looking for stories that are stories about issues that affect Pacific Islanders and are important to Pacific Islanders. And there are other opportunities as well to involve Pacific Islanders in your project that we'll get to in just a little bit in the training plan. Connie, do you have or actually any of you, any notes on kind of your approach to building a key creative team?
I think for me, the way I like to view filmmaking, it's always a community-based kind of project. So reaching out to your community, to your connections, and trying to send the script to those people who you think are the best fitted for the job, and that they actually going to connect with the story you're trying to bring forward. I feel that when people connect with the story, everything else, the collaboration process unfolds a lot easier than if we were to do it by merit alone. So for me, when sending out the script and asking for collaborators, I'm always interested on them to connect with the story first, because I think we're all storytellers, and that's why we're doing this. It sometimes we do have a big filmmaking community that we already know because we are in it or have been in it for a while. It can be daunting when you're just starting, but look at what you already have. You're already under the awareness of Pacific Islanders and communication, and there's a lot of support there. Maybe you have more suggestions on how to connect with other collaborators.
Yeah, I think if you're starting out and you might not have a pool of filmmaking colleagues, there are lots of places you could look to find people to work with. I would say ACM at University of Hawaii, maybe the local university to where you are might have a film program, and you could sort of connect with some of the graduates from there and collaborate. I think in Honolulu specifically, there's great organizations like Hawaii Filmmakers Collective. There are like Facebook platforms that you could hunt down. I definitely think there's if you don't have the network built just yet, there's always 1 or 2 or 3 degrees of separation. So it's worth even just asking friends, hey, you know anybody that does this kind of thing, and you just don't know what you might uncover. Even local cable access, Olelo has incredible resources and a lot of people who go there to study. And I think for anyone who is Hawaii based, that's a really great place to look into as well. Or if you're somewhere else, like maybe the local cable access might provide training and other people that you could connect with too. So all kinds of things.
Okay, audience and distribution. So this part of an application, I think, can sometimes read like a little bit of an afterthought, but it's actually crucially important. It's basically asking you to think about why you want to tell this story and for whom. Or another way of saying that would be like, who will this project matter to and why will it matter? And for PIC specifically, we want to know how it relates to Pacific Islanders, because that is at the core of what we do, of what our mission is. And additionally, the potential for it to affect change. So this can be and should be, I think, a really thoughtful portion of your application. Like, this is kind of like the big why, what is it all for question of your entire project. So I would kind of like to hear briefly from all of you about, you know, how you view this component of the application and when you start thinking about it.
I mean, if you're writing, everyone has a different creative process, but I think, you know, when you're writing, even oftentimes I'll think about who am I writing to, right? Who is the person that I think would want to see this, or, you know, and keeping those kinds of things in mind. And also, if I'm not sure, like for an application like this, if I think there's like a niche, like a certain niche of viewership, because, you know, you can't just say 19 to 65, you know, would love to, but I don't think things work in those age brackets anymore. There's a great specificity that I think platforms like Facebook have allowed us to sort of find, like people that like hula, and you can look up like how large the hula community is, and that gives a sense of what the scope is. Where is hula prevalent? You know, if your piece is about hula, maybe you could say there are a lot of people that are practitioners in these areas with this volume of people. So it's a really nice way to kind of start thinking specifically about how many people actually would be able to see this film. And of course, we all want to say that there is like universal relevance to your work as well. And so there's always that, but knowing that there's a specificity as well, like what are those brackets that the film deals with that might actually gain viewers, like, you know, people who work in the criminal justice system, people who have family members who are dealing with issues in the criminal justice system, you know, and thinking about that in terms of numbers as well. That's also helpful to kind of define a size and scope of audience.
Mm-hmm. And Braden, you'd also kind of alluded to this section when you were talking about fundraising.
Sure.
As well.
Well, your question was when you start thinking about, right, the audience, and I mean, I think for something like this, you have to from the very beginning, because, you know, there is a little sense of the political angle, you know, the socio-political angle. Who is this for? And, you know, a lot of filmmakers are doing things individually. They want to, you know, just as a very artistic statement, and that's fine. But to work with PIC, you have to be able to align with your producer's goals, and having thought about, you know, those other institutions that might also align with those goals, whatever your issue is, and whether it's human trafficking or criminal justice reform or, you know, overdevelopment, landlessness, whatever. There are places out there that, you know, are doing that kind of work in the nonprofit field, or you know, trying to help. And so I think thinking about that, if you have a story that will appeal to the community, you should have that in mind before you. And then, like I said, it helps with fundraising because you know where to go then after you've done that research.
I think this is a great place to ask yourself the question. This is why is why am I doing this and who this is for? If you keep those two in mind at all stages of your process, it will get through the dark days or, you know, whatever the process is, however challenging, if you can always remind yourself, okay, who am I doing this for? And where is it going to live? What home is it going to have? When can people access it? And is my audience in line with the distribution that is being offered at the moment? So I think those are two very good mantras that one could just keep along with your budget and you'll be just fine.
Okay, so now on to our training plan section. So part of this funding initiative includes that you must provide specific training opportunities to emerging Pacific Islander filmmakers, talent, and crew. So we want to see, how do you plan to offer that training or mentorship, and to whom are you offering it? And even in a larger sense too, how will this plan give emerging Pacific Islander filmmakers something to build their careers on, or to strengthen their careers? Can you give us just like some maybe a brief example of how you approach this with the Queen's Flowers and with Last Taxi Dance?
Well, for us, I leaned on Kiara very heavily for this when I was crafting it, but the thought was we weren't going to focus on the crew opportunities, because there were enough of those opportunities with TV production here, and we really wanted to focus on places that were underrepresented, fields that were underrepresented, and opportunities we could create, or that the script would create, to get Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders in front of the camera and other things. So we focused mostly on talent. That was our pitch. Highlighted the different roles. We talked about the use of Hawaiian language also, and what we would need to do to train up for that. And then I think the third, music, obviously. That was the third place that we wanted to focus on. And we didn't try to do everything, but those are the three things that we felt in the script we give a chance to put into a film and get it out there in the world, and feature some Pacific Islander talent.
I think this is a good place to say, where can you do the most good, right? Like, think about your project and all things involved, and like, how can you make this one project that you're funding on a shoestring kind of budget, still be meaningful and impactful, not just for yourself, but for the community in general. So I think this is a great space to think about those things and get creative with it, and it's not just what we always go for. They're like, oh, well, I'm creating jobs, but like, how can you go above and beyond that mindset and actually be able to make actual change?
Yeah, it's not just, oh, we'll just have PAs, right? It can be more fun than that, and you could pick that piece that you could dedicate to. So if you want to provide opportunities throughout the phases of production, awesome. But if knowing you have a very specific scope of resources, then maybe you'll have more time in post, and you could bring on somebody to train in post-production with you, and then really give them a deep dive and a real authentic experience in terms of support and learning. So it can be something, it doesn't have to be like huge, but there are moments where, if you're really strong at one thing and you feel like you could bring someone on and teach them, like, great. And there are a lot of incredible places to find up and coming filmmakers that would really benefit from the experience. Again, like any local university to you, any up and coming crew from the universities that are training. Hawaii Women in Filmmaking, I've definitely worked with some really incredible interns from that organization. So, there's lots of really great places to look.
Those are all great ideas. Okay, so that's our last portion of the application. Before we go into Q&A, I wanted to just recap some of the big takeaways, and then give you each a chance if you have any takeaways to add to that list. So first of all, is the story that you want to cover viable? Do you have a story? Do you have access? If that's a point of concern, and is it a Pacific Islander story? Are you capable of delivering on it? Do you have experience, and do you have other creatives with you who have experience to do this, what you're describing? Is your plan detailed, and is it reasonable, especially in regards to budget and in regards to time? You know, just some tips here. Do your research, be descriptive and as clear as possible. Details and clarity, especially with your storyline and with your budget, are super important. Start early. The application window is open now, but please don't wait until the 11th hour to open it and begin looking at it and trying to piece everything together, because it does take time. Just the process of applying takes time, but also the process of building all of the components takes a lot of time to do. Writing, just write, and then write some more, which kind of harks back to details that I was just mentioning. So make sure that you've really very fully and completely described everything. And then finally, for me, I would say don't do it in a vacuum. Look for a group of supporters who can give you help, and readers who can give you feedback. It is, as I think all of you have echoed, filmmaking is a community endeavor, and it takes a lot of people. And don't try to go it alone. Use the help and use the resources. Any final words?
I have 3 things.
Okay.
I would say before you write any grant, make sure and you sort of touch upon this, but make sure you read what the mission statement is of the organization. That always helps to make sure you are viable or you're in alignment with what they're looking to fund. It's a really simple thing to do. Always do it. And then when we talk about write some more and the details of it, make sure it's the right details. So sometimes I go off and I wander as I'm writing. Go back and reread the question, because when these readers are evaluating your application, they're starting off with a checklist to make sure that you're addressing all the things that have been asked of you. So you want to make sure that you're not missing something. And I know it's so hard to fit all the things that you want to say in just that little box of X number of words. But it's totally doable. Just cut out your adjectives and your adverbs and you'll get there. So it's a lot of games that you can play with your language to get yourself there. Just make sure that you're addressing the questions that have been asked of you. Oh, did I forget the last thing? Oh, no. Who else is going to give you $25,000 for writing some paper? So I would say, as difficult or as time consuming as the work of assembling a grant can be, if it takes you 20 hours, that's really great billable hours. You're billing like a really high paid lawyer. So keep that in mind. As lengthy as the process can be, it's a really great opportunity, because you could be a burgeoning filmmaker, or you could be an experienced filmmaker, or you could have a team of everything in between. And to know that there's an opportunity to spend a couple of hours working on an application, knowing you have the possibility of getting $25,000 to create a film that has distribution, right, on a platform that people will see, I mean, that's a pretty great opportunity. So even if it's a lot of work, it has a good payoff.
And to your point, I think, don't sell yourself short, go for it. At the end of this, at the very least, you'll have really good notes to build your next application from. So don't shy away from applying. We can all do it. We all have our little processes. I like to copy the question, put it in a thing and answer it and go back, like Kiara says, and make sure all the points are there. Build your own process. We all have different creative processes, but in the end, I think we are here to tell you that, you can do it. Anybody can do it, such as long as you commit to yourself to put in the time. At the end of it, no matter what, you have gained something that you didn't know when you started.
I totally agree. I think a lot of projects actually end up better through the grant process, because it really forces you to think outside of your bubble and begin to translate what your work is outside of you. And I think there's a great value in that. So regardless of winning the application or not, and hopefully you will, you're going to get something out of that process. And I think your work will be stronger for it. So it's definitely worth the time and opportunity to do it.
I hated doing
Okay,
it.
loved it. It was so good.
But after it was Paul, I all of a sudden had all these materials, these resources that I could then use to apply for other things. And because PIC was so thorough, or forced me to be so thorough, it was easier actually when we went and applied for fiscal sponsorship, we went for other grants, and they wanted less words than what PIC had. So it was easy to just take that stuff and repurpose it. So, as much of a pain as it is, I'll tag on to what my producers are saying here. Look at it as an opportunity. Look at it not as a burden, but as a real blessing to be able to work with an organization like PIC that wants you to be successful and wants to give away money. So if you can get through this, in the long run, it's definitely helpful.
Cool. And that hopefully speaks to why we're here doing this with you right now. We want more voices, we want more stories, and we want your applications. We want to hear from you. So I'm hoping that this was helpful and gave you some tips on how to begin that process. So with that in mind, I think we can open it up to Q&A if we've got any questions.
So Kaylee, we have a few already that I've saved till this Q&A time. Let's see, I'll just go in the order that they came. So this is more, I think this falls in the bucket more about around maybe advice from the producers here. It says, in this 18-month timeline approximation, how do filmmakers continue juggling their full-time jobs, as some of us are not filmmaking full-time yet, while going into production and post?
Oh, I don't think you ever need to be a full-time filmmaker. I think there's some incredible filmmakers who have full-time jobs doing other stuff. So I think it's about finding where your windows are, where your breaks. Like if you're a teacher, boom, spring break, summer. Those are going to be your priority times that you're going to build your timeline around. Maybe you're going to shoot your film on weekends, and that's how maybe it'll take you the month of March. You're shooting every weekend the month of March to get your 8 days of production in. I'm not saying it's easy when you've got a full-time job, a family, or all the other things, but it's like, okay, where are those windows that you can carve out and make it doable so you can realize your dream?
Yeah, there's different strategies. It's all about workflow. Some of us will wake up, 2 hours earlier, or go to bed 2 hours later. Some of us will dedicate, I'll say, okay, this day, Friday, I'm going to deal with, my application or my project for the first however many hours. So dedicate, and it's a discipline. It really is, but it's definitely doable to juggle it.
Lunchtime, lunch break, those kind of things.
Okay, thank you. The next question that we have is from Mary. She asks, how common is it that a PIC-funded project pays crew?
Pays the crew?
Pays?
Yeah.
Yeah, everybody.
Always.
Yeah.
You got $25,000. You can share a little bit with everybody.
Exactly. So I'll just chime in and just say that, we know that 25,000 and echo what Kaylee said earlier, which is, there may be projects, and we completely understand this, that need more than the 25,000 that we're offering. And what our hope is that when you're putting together your budget, putting together your crew and key creative personnel, is that you can use some of our funding to pay yourself and pay the people that are working with you. Because that is one thing that, it is one of the biggest things that we try to support with any funded project, is just to, encourage and, encourage filmmakers to pay themselves.
And I think this, film should also be thought of as it is a business, and it has to be a self-sustaining one. So you have to make sure that you are set up to do that. You can't be a filmmaker calling in favors all the time. So you have to, whatever your budget is, make it so that, everybody is getting a part of it. Maybe it's not the full rate that they're expecting, but it is what you can offer. And with that in mind, I think it's a good.
I think a lot of people are reasonable. They recognize that this isn't going to be the same budget that a studio film might have. But so, making sure people understand, okay, we might not be able to go Gucci on this film, right? We're not going to go those rates, but, we will be able to compensate you for your time to some degree. And I think that's important. And most people get it. Most people know you're not doing a McDonald's commercial. And if they don't, then maybe they're not the right fit.
Well, and also, and this is something I learned, Kiara taught me this, was that if people are getting paid, they will be a little more invested. It's just, human nature. And if they're not getting paid and then something comes up where they are getting paid, they probably have to go and take that one. There's the fact that they're getting paid, even a little something, it helps them be more invested in the project itself. So, yeah, definitely have to.
Thank you. So the next question we have is, okay, can footage shot / produced with the Digital Shorts Fund or incorporated in the final short be used in other projects such as a feature film or educational videos? So I'll go ahead and just answer that. And hopefully this answers your question. Many times we have projects that apply for Digital Shorts Fund and produce a short film with the intention of using that short film as a proof of concept for a feature-length film. And that's completely fine. So long as, and on our website, we talk about this a little bit, but so long as we still, with the short film project, you're licensing rights in that short film. So just know that. And those are the kind of constraints or limitations that you'd be working with when you do create your feature film. And then for educational videos, so that's a little tricky. And I would say probably more complicated question to answer in this forum. But if you want to reach out to me or Kaylee directly to talk about that further, we'd be happy to set up a call with you on that. And then I'm gonna jump to the next question from George that says, say if my narrative short idea is based on a feature length IP that I originated and also own, would I still be considered for this fund? In other words, would I be giving up my existing IP rights? So that's, if I understand your question correctly, you're saying kind of the opposite of what I was just talking about, which is having a longer version created already and then wanting to do a shorter version. So that it all depends on the details. And again, if you want to set up a call to discuss further with myself or Kaylee, reach out to us. We can set up a call with that. But generally speaking, not knowing your project or the details about your project, generally speaking, what it sounds like is it probably wouldn't be qualified for the Digital Shorts Fund if you're looking to go from a feature-length film to a short film. And then let's see if there are any other, oh, you know what? I'm not sure if everybody can see all of the questions and the answers that I've been typing. So I'm gonna go back to Keikama's question, which is, does PIC ever fund a project in more than one stage of development, e.g. funding during pre-production and post-production? So my answer was yes, but only for full-length documentary projects funded through Media Fund. So with the Media Fund, we have a rolling R&D call. And then we have 2 deadlines a year for both production and post funding. And that's it for the questions that are in the Q&A panel. Does anybody else have any questions? Nope. Okay. Let me see. There was something that, oh, I was gonna say one thing to add on about access. So there are some times where you should be talking about access if your project is a narrative project, and that is when your story is based on a real life person. And a real life person that is like, you know, a public figure or a celebrity or whatnot. Like, you know, if your story is based off of, you know, a well-known musician, and your treatment and your whole project, you know, you're talking about using a lot of this person's music within your film, you should also talk about access to this person's, you know, music, whether you've had a conversation with this person, if it's a deceased person, like their estate, you know, how likely will it be for you to get, you know, permission to use the music or license the music. You know, if it is a very well-known person, like a big public figure, you're gonna wanna kind of already have a conversation with the person or the person's family if they're deceased. Start thinking about like, you know, maybe coming up with an agreement for you to have rights, life story rights, that sort of thing. So there are some times in a narrative project where you want to talk about access. And I'm done.
Yeah, then I guess if there are no more questions, is there one more?
Oh yeah, there is one more. This is coming from George again, who asks, if I were to have an all local crew and meet those requirements, would it be appropriate to consider a narrative short with Upper Pacific Indigenous cultures, i.e. Japan? A narrative short with, I'm not sure if you mean crew or story. Crew meet those requirements, would it be appropriate to consider a narrative short with Upper Pacific Indigenous? Oh, maybe you're talking about story. So the story can only be Indigenous Pacific Islanders as defined as what Kaylee described before. So Indigenous peoples of Polynesia, Micronesia, and Melanesia. So no to Japan. And, oh, okay. That's it for the questions in the Q&A panel.
Anything else you had to add, Cheryl?
Nope.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all so much for being here with us.
Thank you.
And sharing your wisdom. And thank you all for joining in.
Thanks, everybody. Good luck.
Yeah, good luck.